Good evening and welcome. My name is Joel Westfall, and it is my absolute honor to be the Deputy Director here at the Gerald R. Ford Museum and Library. Wow, what a crowd. Great crowd. Thank you very much for coming and being here tonight with us all. Just before we begin tonight's program, just a couple of very quick items I'd like to mention. We do have a lot of events coming up. Just for everyone's sake, when you leave the auditorium, there will be some pamphlets and information about these programs, but just really quickly, and I don't want to take up a lot of Tom's time, we have our big tree lighting event this Thursday, followed by our holiday open house on December 3rd. We've got something very new planned, very avant-garde, on December 13th in support of our rock and roll exhibit upstairs from the Rock Hall of Fame. We have a 1970s punk night with live music. And of course, our Vietnam lecture series will begin back again on December 6th with Dr. Edward Merolda coming and talking about the admirals in Vietnam. And of course, our 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive on January 30th with Colonel Richard Camp, the prior head of Marine Corps history and his experiences at Khe Sanh. If you're interested with these events, you can get the information outside. And as normal, tonight's event is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration, along with our wonderful support from the Ford Foundation. We are always very, very grateful to the Ford Foundation and the members of many of you who are friends of Ford, and thank you for your ongoing support, because without your support, our exhibits, educational programs, research grants, and many of these other things would not be possible. So I want to thank you all if you are friends of Ford or are thinking of becoming friends of Ford. So I will do what Elaine always likes to do. So before we get started, please make sure your phones are off and put on silent mode. Thank you very much. And so then on to tonight's program. Tonight we welcome Tom Tudor to the Ford Museum. He came highly recommended to us by the wonderful folks at the USS Silverside submarine in Muskegon. If you haven't stopped by there, I encourage you to do so. It's a wonderful marvel of naval history. As someone who worked at the Pentagon for the U.S. Navy, I highly recommend going out and see this. Tom has been a distinguished speaker for 25 years, presenting a moving and informative narration of, of our nation's most hallowed ground, Arlington National Cemetery. Mr. Tudor speaks to hundreds of organizations and institutions nationwide, is the authority on the history of Arlington and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Mr. Tudor has served as a sentinel and then relief commander at Arlington's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from February 1969 to Memorial Day of 1970. He is the past president of the Society of the Honor Guard, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and is a member of their board. Please join me in welcoming our special guest lecturer tonight, Tom Tudor.
Thank you, Joel. And Kristen, we need to drop these lights here a little bit, if we can. Thank you. I was given a huge gift as a 20-year-old soldier in the United States Army when I volunteered for and was selected to serve as sentinel and then commander of the relief at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. I got to be one of these guys, and that is me. This photograph was taken on the 15th of June of 1969 upon the 4th month anniversary of my first ever walk on the mat at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, walking the mat is probably the hardest job I ever loved. It was, if you've been in DC in the summer, we were wearing wool uniforms. Only part of our skin exposed was from here to here. And this was before Gatorade, guys, okay? This was in the era of salt tablets and lots of water. So it was the 4th month anniversary of my first ever walk on the mat here at the tomb. This is the tomb block, which covers the World War I unknown, and it says, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." This is 79 tons, and beneath here is the representative of the 3,350 Americans who went missing in the Great War, the First World War. There is nobody, living or dead, who ever knew who this person was. I will talk about the Vietnam unknown in a little bit. This is the crypt cover for the Korean unknown, and this is the representative of the 8,200 plus that went missing in the Korean War, and this is the crypt cover for the World War II unknown, and he is the representative of the 78,750 Americans who did not come back from that war. Let me repeat that number, 78,750. So, I got to be this guy, and this was the first day that I got to wear the Tomb Guard identification badge. The Tomb Guard identification badge is the second least awarded badge in the U.S. military. It is the only badge in the U.S. military that can be revoked for as long as the owner lives. I've been in the Army for 47 and a half years, and if I do anything that brings disrespect or dishonor upon the United States Army, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the unknowns themselves, this can be taken away from me. We just issued number 655, the Army did. Mine is number 78. We have revoked 21 of them for various offenses, including felony convictions and even driving under the influence, okay? Now, that email that says that we promise never to drink, swear, or smoke, everybody seen that? It's a bunch of hooey. But we hold ourselves to a higher standard for all of our lives so that we will never give up this badge. We have in our society a motto, just like the Boy Scout motto is be prepared. Our motto is soldiers never die until they are forgotten. Tomb guards never forget. We also have something we call the Sentinels Creed, and it goes like this. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will in honored glory rest under my eternal vigilance. And we take that seriously and we take it to heart. I will talk again about walking the mat and serving at the tomb, but I want to give you a little dose of Arlington history. Arlington was not always a cemetery. The first person to own the property was a ship's captain named Robert Housing, who was given 6,000 acres of land across the Potomac River from what is now Washington, D.C. Can you imagine what that's worth? Most of Arlington, probably all of Roslyn, probably a large chunk of Alexandria, tens of billions of dollars, just the property. He sold it for 6 barrels of tobacco. It went into the Alexander family. The Alexanders created Alexandria and incorporated it in 1742. In 1778, a guy with a famous mother buys 1,100 of those acres, and those 1,100 acres that were purchased by John Parke Custis become Arlington and Fort Myer, Virginia. Same exact boundaries today. His mother was Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. His father, Daniel Parke Custis, died in 1757. He and his sister were adopted by George Washington, who had no biological or natural children of his own, after he married their mother. Martha Dandridge Custis became Martha Washington January 6th of 1779, and they were raised at Mount Vernon. And he became an aide to his general father during the Revolutionary War. He purchased this land in 1778, right in the middle of the Revolution, an act of courage and faith, I would believe. But he bought it, and 3 years later he died at the siege of Yorktown after the surrender of Cornwallis. He got sick and died, camp fever, anything, typhus, diphtheria, any number of diseases. And he passed the property to his 6-month-old son, George Washington Parke Custis, named in honor of his adoptive grandfather. Well, Washington turns around and adopts the grandson as his own son immediately. So, George Washington Parke Custis, in his 20s, begins to build this house. It takes him 16 years to complete it. This is what you see when you look from the Lincoln Memorial across the Memorial Bridge into Arlington. At night, you see the flame flickering right beneath it, and that is Kennedy's grave, because JFK's grave is right down here, okay, right below the mansion. This is dead center on that view over across the Memorial Bridge. So he builds this house, takes him 16 years to complete. When upon completion is considered one of the grandest houses in America. This is a park ranger standing here. Those columns are 5 feet in diameter, 30 feet tall. You can't see this part or this part. It's 142 feet from end to end. George Washington Parke Custis has 4 children, and only one of them lives to be an adult, and her name is Mary Anna Randolph Custis. And in 1831, in the room right behind these columns called the family parlor, she marries her 3rd cousin and childhood playmate. Recognize him? Recognize him now? Robert E. Lee. Now, they were related 3 different ways, but they were 3rd cousins through the Carter family and 3rd cousins once removed through the Randolphs. So, now this gentleman, I will remind you, served faithfully in the United States Army for 32 years, from his graduation at West Point in 1829 all the way until the outbreak of the War of Rebellion or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on where I'm speaking. So he is forced to make a terrible decision. He is a Virginian. He goes back to 1639 to Richard Lee, the founder. He has 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence in his direct family. Light Horse Harry Lee was his father, or Henry Lee III. Francis Lightfoot Lee and Richard Henry Lee both signed the Declaration of Independence. His father was governor of Virginia and a Revolutionary War hero. But when it came time to make a decision, he was summoned 1 week after Fort Sumter was fired on. April 18th, 1861, he was summoned to the district and offered command of Union troops, which he refused. And he resigned his commission in the United States Army, and he wrote a letter, a very eloquent letter to Winfield Scott, resigning his commission and saying, I value your friendship and your mentorship, but I shall not raise my sword save in defense of my native Virginia. And he goes and he fights for the Confederate States of America. His wife follows to Richmond, and they abandon the property. Federal troops come across in May and take control of it. That's Irvin McDowell, commander of the 1st Army of the Potomac. It wasn't called that yet, but it became the Army of the Potomac. And this was the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac throughout the Civil War. The property is seized because Mrs. Lee fails to show up in person to pay $92.07 in taxes. She sent a male cousin with the money in good faith. The money is refused, and that refusal in 1882 will be the crux of a court case. The Supreme Court will give title back to their son long after they are both dead, because she was denied due process because she had made a good faith effort to pay that tax. But the property is seized and auctioned off. There's only one bidder in the auction, and that is the government. They get it for $26,800. And at the urging of this man, it becomes a cemetery. This is Montgomery Cunningham Meigs, the most important Union general nobody's ever heard of. He was quartermaster general of the Army throughout the Civil War, except for the first month. Joseph E. Johnston was quartermaster, and of course Johnston went to the Confederate side. He was an engineer by trade, but he hated Lee. And his way of getting back at Lee was by making Arlington a Union graveyard. So he put his name on everything right there. He put his name on the Capitol. He did the Capitol Dome project from 1853 to 59. If you go in, he's got Meigs all over the place. He was a very shy, very self-effacing guy. The first military burial took place May 13th, 1864. Private William Henry Chrisman of Pennsylvania. Shortly thereafter, there's Chrisman, and next to him is Private William Blatt, the first combat casualty. He died of peritonitis in a hospital. He died of combat wounds. Notice the Union shield on the grave. And this is what Arlington looked like in 1865. And these are not stones. These are wooden planks that are whitewashed and stenciled. And they had a 5-year cycle of repainting them. Well, 5 years? Really? Seriously? Think it's going to last 5 years? Well, in 1873, Congress got smart and authorized marble headstones for the first time in 1873. And marble has been the standard in national cemeteries ever since. So, this is the grave of J.H. Smith, a U.S. colored troop. He is in Section 27, and he is right next to Blatt. They did not They did not segregate the initial burials at Arlington. After Arlington became an official U.S. cemetery, then they began the segregation, racial segregation in the cemetery on June 15th, 1864. Now, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs hated Robert E. Lee, and he hated anybody who had gone to West Point and fought for the Confederate States of America. He considered them worthy of trial, conviction, and hanging. He didn't get his way. But he got back at Lee this way. He dug a pit in Mrs. Lee's rose garden, 20 feet around and 10 feet deep, and buried the skeletal remains of 2,111 unknown soldiers gathered after the war from the fields of Bull Run and the route to the Rappahannock. Now, could he be sure that they were all Union soldiers? They were just bones. Well, probably a few Confederates in there, but he got the point. The point was that you will never wish to come back to this place because we have a mass grave in your rose garden. Now, when I talk to school groups, I have the youngest looking person in the room come up and touch my hand. This was done in September of 1866. And I tell them that they now have a flesh and blood connection with this year. How do they say, how is that possible? They look at me like I've got antlers growing out of my head. The hand that you just touched, young person, held the hand of a man born that year, and I called him Grandpa. My grandfather was born in 1866, the same year that this was committed in Mrs. Lee's rose garden. Now, this is the place where they observed the first ever Decoration Day. Now, my mom called it Decoration Day until she died. She was born in 1913. It had been turned to Memorial Day in 1888, but it was called Decoration Day from the first declaration by General John Logan, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1868, and first observed in Arlington on May the 30th. The reason he chose May the 30th, flowers were in bloom from Maine to California. So you could go pick your neighbor's you could go pick flowers and put them on your loved ones' graves. This is where James Garfield delivered the first address at the first ever Decoration Day. So Arlington was not a place of great honor at the outset. It was a place of great necessity. It was a potter's field in 1865. But after this, and after the Union generals started dying off, and they said, you know what? I'd like to get in Arlington as close to the front door of that mansion as I possibly can. That is the beginning of Arlington becoming a place of great honor and a place of great desire for persons who served under that general to also be buried. So it sort of snowballed. And by the 1890s, and I'll have a slide later, of the USS Maine. This is, of course, just a shot of generic World War I shot. These are actually, I believe, American helmets. These are not British helmets. In 1915, a gentleman, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, after the 17-day-long battle, Second Battle of Ypres, the first battle in which the Germans used poison gas, both mustard and chlorine gas, after 17 days of nonstop firing, he sat down and wrote this poem. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, that's a misprint. Between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And he threw the poem away. And his friend rescued it and sent it to London. And it was published in the magazine Punch on the 8th of December, 1915, and it went viral. Anything could go viral in 1915, and it was translated into most languages in the world. It became the symbol of Remembrance Day for the Brits and for the French. In 1920, the American Legion adopted it, and then they dropped it because in 1922, the VFW picked it up and created the Buddy Poppy. And the Buddy Poppy, of course, I wish they were sold like they used to be everywhere. Everywhere you'd see them. I'm all for the resurrection of the poppy as a symbol of our sacrifices of our military in all wars, not just the Great War. So, the Brits in 1920 and the French in 1920, on the second anniversary of the signing of the armistice, interred unknowns. The Brits interred theirs in Westminster Abbey with the poets and the kings. the French beneath the Arc de Triomphe with an eternal flame, and that eternal flame was Jackie Kennedy's inspiration for the eternal flame at JFK's grave. And we chose Arlington. We had three suggestions. One was Central Park by Rodman Wanamaker, wanted it to be a tourist attraction in Central Park. There was a crypt beneath the Capitol building, beneath a rotunda that was built for George Washington's body, and of course, Washington chose to be buried at Mount Vernon, so it was never used. And Arlington, in front of the newly inaugurated National Memorial Amphitheater, and that won out. This is our unknown. Coming out of the place of selection, a Sergeant Edward F. Younger chose the unknown by laying a spray of white roses on one of 4 identical caskets. 4 sets of remains had been brought in from 4 different American cemeteries. The caskets had been shuffled in the middle of the night, so nobody knew which one had come from which cemetery, and he chose the second from the left. And here he is coming out, and here he is going to the train. There are the roses used to make the selection, and that is John J. Pershing following. They go to the USS Olympia, which takes them across. That was Dewey's flagship in the Battle of Manila Bay in 1901. They take him across the ocean to the Naval Gun Factory, from the Naval Gun Factory to the U.S. Capitol, from the U.S. Capitol to the caissons, and then, of course, Pershing will walk with him all the way to Arlington, where Warren G. Harding will do the dedication. This is Pershing dropping a fistful of soil into the grave. The bottom of this crypt has a layer of soil 2 inches deep from the battlegrounds of France, so that this American soldier is forever lying on the French soil that he died defending in 1917 or 1918. And the tomb was not guarded. This young widow is praying over the tomb. No guard to keep her away. In 1925, a veteran of the Great War came around the corner and found a family with a blanket spread on the top of it having a picnic lunch. He chased them away. He went to the White House. He got in to see then President Calvin Coolidge, explained the situation. Coolidge put a civilian guard on the next day. March 25th, 1926, the United States Army took over. The United States Army has always guarded the tomb of the unknown soldier, no other service. 2 reasons. The Army is the senior service by about 4 months, and Arlington is administered by the Department of the Army, not the Veterans Affairs, but Department of the Army administers Arlington National Cemetery. In 1931, this was put in place, and in 1937, it was discovered people were coming in at night with hammers and chisels and knocking pieces off while the tomb was not guarded and taking them home as souvenirs. Midnight, July 2nd, 1937, a 24-hour guard was posted. The tomb has been guarded 24/7 nonstop ever since, despite hurricanes, Bob, Isabel, Irene, Sandy, Snowmageddon. Remember Snowmageddon? That was when they closed the cemetery for 5 days, but they still, of course, always have guarded the tomb. And when Isabel came up, they were given permission to withdraw to the National Memorial Amphitheater, and the tomb guards, they did not refuse orders. They were not ordered to do so, but they never did it. And none of the guys or gals, 7 women have walked at the mat at the tomb of the unknown soldier. 4 of them have earned the Tomb Guard Identification Badge. No male or female who has ever guarded the tomb and wears this badge would ever be the first to walk away. You'd rather have a tree fall on them first. And I would agree, and I'd take that tree. So, in 1958, this is the Korean unknown aboard the USS Canberra off the Virginia coast. The Korean unknown has already been chosen at the Cemetery of the Pacific by a Sergeant Ned Lyle. This is Corpsman William Charette, who is choosing one of these 2 caskets. The complexity of the World War II unknown was unprecedented. There were 13 candidates from Europe, all the way from North Africa to Holland, brought to the Epinal Cemetery and Memorial in France near the Vosges Mountains. And a Major General, Edward O'Neill, chose the 5th one from the left. The casket from the Pacific was chosen at Hickam Air Force Base on the 16th of May by Glenn Eggleston, Colonel of U.S. Air Force, and was brought to the Canberra. This one will be buried at sea. These 2 will come to the Capitol Rotunda, where they will lie in state for 48 hours. Tens of thousands of Americans filed by and paid their respects at the U.S. Capitol building in 1958. And on Memorial Day, they were taken to the National Memorial Amphitheater. I asked a bunch of 8th graders who this was. No clue. Joe Biden. Don't think so. They know what Kennedy looks like, but they have no clue what President Eisenhower looked like. He is bestowing medals of honor upon the unknowns. And then here is, right before the flag folding, this is then Vice President Nixon acting as next of kin to the Korean unknown, and then Ike acting as next of kin to the World War II unknown. President Reagan presiding over the interment of remains said to be unknown from the Vietnam conflict. They never really were. May 11th, 1972, First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blassie, a 1970 graduate of the Air Force Academy. I live 4 miles south of the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Was flying an A-37 Dragonfly in close air support over An Loc, Vietnam. His wingman saw him get hit, roll over, and go in. No parachute with a fireball. It was behind enemy lines. About 6 months later, they get to the crash site. They are looking for him. They find wreckage of an A-37. They find artifacts consistent with an A-37. They find 4 ribs, a humerus, a part of a pelvis, and a wallet with his ID card in it, Michael Joseph Blassie's picture ID and money. The money and the wallet and the ID disappear on a flight with an Arven crew to Tan Son Nhut. Therefore, that was the best proof they had. So they labeled those remains believed to be Michael Joseph Blassie, put them on a shelf, and never informed the family that they had believed to be remains. And I understand that. You don't say you have remains until you're darn sure. So, 1979, a pathologist was brought in, and he called those remains into question on spurious, very spurious circumstances and criteria. They reclassified him X-26. They buried him on Memorial Day of 1984. I'd hate to be the guy that let that happen. They buried him on Memorial Day of 1984 as the unknown. I will talk about those in just a little bit. So they bury him. The family finds out, the Blassie family finds out that they are referring to those remains still after the interment as believed to be Michael Joseph Blassie. So they get an order to disinter. And on May 14th, 1998, they bring him out, and June 28th of that same year, mitochondrial DNA results confirm that it was indeed Michael Joseph Blassie, and his remains are now at the VA Jefferson Barracks Cemetery near St. Louis, Missouri. There's Michael. I spoke at the Colorado Springs Library, and a lady came up to me afterwards and said, my sister dated him when he was a cadet at the academy. And you could bet money, anytime he came to Sunday dinner, the next 2 days, there would be a thank you note in the mail from Michael. Just that kind of a kid. This is his sister, and she came to our reunion. I'm past president of the society. I was president in this photograph. And she came and told the story from her family's perspective. And boy, what a story she told. And she brought with her the artifacts that had been in the grave with him for 14 years. And let us touch them and examine them. Very heart-rending story. They were caught in the middle, and they had a family meeting, and finally at the end of the meeting, they referred to Mom. And what do you think, Mom? She said, let's bring Michael home. And they did. This is section 60, sometimes referred to as the saddest acre in America. Some evidence thereof. Some more evidence thereof. It's where the recent KIAs from Afghanistan and Iraq are buried. There are 1,500 graves in this photograph. Arlington has 400,000 buried there with about 300,000 markers. Well, why are there fewer markers than graves? Because many of them are spousal burials, where the veteran goes in 9 feet deep if it's a full casket burial. The spouse goes in 6 feet deep. They're in the same plot. The veteran's information's on one side of the stone and the wife's is on the reverse. Very common practice. It's standard practice in national cemeteries. So, if we have 300,000 markers and there are 1,500 in this photograph, you would need to repeat this photograph 20 times that way and 10 times deep to get 300,000. And that's all in 624 acres in Arlington National Cemetery. Pretty amazing place. Absolutely amazing place. My daughters refused to believe that I was ever young. This photograph was taken in the summer of '68 at Fort Bliss, Texas, during basic combat training. I'd had 2 years of college, so they sent me to infantry school with the thought that I might think about OCS, Officer Candidate School, or a non-commissioned officer school. So I went to Fort Ord, California for infantry training. At Fort Ord, the second week I was there, they had a meeting. Anybody between the heights of 5'10" and 6'2" who wanted to volunteer for the Old Guard, that's the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment that does all the ceremonial duties in the District of Columbia and environs, including Arlington and burials at Arlington. To go to this room, I went to this building with 40 other guys in my unit. We watched films of the Tomb Guards, of the U.S. Army drill team, of the Caisson platoon, and then filled out a card. And on the back of the card, I wrote why they wanted us to write why we wanted to be in the Old Guard. And I'd been there in 1964 after the Boy Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Was anybody at the '64 Jamboree? Okay, I remember you. What, you and 40,000 other guys. So we went there, and we went to Arlington, and what I wrote was I was so impressed by the guards at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. If I could do that job, I'd jump at it. If I had a chance to do that job, I'd jump at it. Well, orders came down 7 weeks later. I was the only one of those 40. Got sent to Fort Myer, Virginia. The rest went to Vietnam, MACV. So I consider myself quite fortunate that I went to Fort Myer, Virginia. When I got there were 900 guys in the battalion, but only 12 guys doing this job. Not everybody in the Old Guard is a Tomb Guard. It's quite the contrary. So I volunteered for Honor Guard Company, got accepted to that, volunteered for the U.S. Army drill team, got accepted into that, volunteered for the Tomb, and by the way of the Tomb, I spent 3 weeks at the Kennedy grave site and was finally accepted and started walking the mat at the Tomb in February 15th of 1969. I was scared to death on my first walk. People are 3 feet away from you looking to see if you'll screw up. And you know what? You didn't know who they were. They could be in your chain of command. And so your compulsion to be perfect was very, very overwhelming. And so I survived. I survived my first walk and got to about 4 months, and I got to wear the badge on my right breast pocket. And any Tomb Guard, is Don here? Are my Tomb Guard friends here? Okay. You will agree, who are, we got 2? Just Don. Okay. You guys will probably agree with me. About 4 months, you started becoming automatic. About 4 months, you stopped thinking about everything you were supposed to be doing or not doing with your hand or your rifle or your arm. It was sort of that moment when you became automatic, and we can talk about that later on. I am carrying the weapon about 1.5 inches too high here, but I was pumped up this day. So on Halloween of 1969, I became commander of the 2nd Relief, and I changed the guard for 7 months. Until I got out. 7.5 months. I walked the mat for 8 months and then was a relief commander for 7 months. And the relief commander, of course, is the guy who changes the guard.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I am Sergeant Tudor of the United States Army, commander of the relief Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It is requested that visitors remain silent and standing during the changing of the guard. All military personnel in uniform should render the hand salute upon the commands of present arms. Thank you.
That would begin the changing of the guard. It's a little different now, but pretty much the same deal. That gap is bigger than that gap because I have a .45 automatic on my hip. The only live ammo that anybody had when I was there was the relief commander. The Sentinels used to carry a live round until the Korean War, when I spoke to one of the guys, the Korean War guys, that said that they took that away after one of the Sentinels took his own life in the bunk room in 1953. So this is me inspecting the weapon. There's that .45. .45, that was a great weapon. You could hit a barn if you were inside it. Or if you got close enough to the outside, you could hit a barn with, but it scared the hell out of whoever you were shooting at. This is the National Memorial Amphitheater. I'm going to take you up to the top. This seats 5,000 people. It's big. This was dedicated May 15th, 1920. I'm going to take you up to the top, and we're going to look straight down. And this is what we see. This is the mat. This is where the tomb guard walks 21 steps, halts, faces, stands for 21 seconds. If you couldn't glide, you couldn't be a guard. The idea was that the head went straight on a line without bobbing up or down or going side to side. I just got a hip replacement 6 months ago, so I'm kind of getting used to this hip. So 21 steps, halt, face, stand 21 seconds. 21, emblematic of full military honors of the 21-gun salute. 21 steps, 21 seconds. Tomb guards do not wear name tags, so that they are as unknown as the unknowns. Tomb guards do not wear insignia of rank. They do not wear insignia of rank, so they do not outrank the unknowns whose rank we do not know. Okay? So, a little bit of symbolism there. We were as perfect as possible in our uniforms. We pressed our pants to a knife edge, and we shined our shoes incessantly. Shoes probably took more time than anything else. I don't bring my shoes because they do arouse the interest of the TSA. Triple soles, triple heels with metal plates on them. It just doesn't work well in airports. So, 21 steps, halt, face, stand 21 seconds. Now this is the sentinel box. That was the thing with the little spikes on it I showed you a little bit earlier. The spikes are there for a reason. The only time we could take ourselves off of this mat because of weather, we walked in everything. Imagine getting dressed up as nicely as you can and going and standing in the crappiest weather you can think of for an hour. And doing it again and again and again. Okay? That's what we did. But we walked in it all. Rain, snow, sleet, hail. And any tomb guard will tell you that summer was the worst because of the heat and the humidity in D.C. It was awful. We sweated. And I'd walk in the snow before I'd walk in the heat again, if I given the chance. So, but we could take ourselves in here if we felt threatened by lightning, and those little spikes were lightning rods. They were not decorative, they were lightning rods. I never went in there for weather. I never went in there because I was afraid I was going to get hit by lightning, but we could do that. The reason this is here, and this well-worn path is here, is that this is where the sentinel goes for wreath laying. Last year, they laid over 2,300 wreaths at the tomb. That's crazy. We didn't lay nearly that many back in our day because that's like 6 a day. So, but 21 steps, halt, face, stand 21 seconds. If somebody came over the chains,
it is requested that visitors remain on the outside of the chains.
They didn't respond.
It is requested that visitors remain on the outside of the chains.
If they didn't move then, bayonet, rifle butt. If a little kid came under the chains, we didn't bayonet little kids.
It is requested that parents keep their children on the outside of the chains.
Lay it on mom and dad. Now, people would come up and tell you jokes in conversational tones, because in our day, these chains went right around the end of the mat, right around the back of the tomb, so people could come up and get very close to you. Were you guys pre-58? So people could cross the mat back in those days. But people could get very close to you, and you'd hear them telling you, you know, what do you call a deer with no eyes? No eye deer, you know, something stupid. Not funny, okay? Not gonna laugh. The things that could challenge you are the unexpected. And I had just gotten down to this end of the mat one day and faced, and I heard bzzz, largest bumblebee I'd ever seen in my life landed on the tip of my nose. I could feel his hind legs inside my nostrils. I did what I was trained to do, which was absolutely nothing. I didn't look at him, I didn't blink, I let him sit there for about 10 seconds and he flew away. About 3 weeks later, I'm at the same end of the mat, and this lady had come up the steps and was standing right in, lady was standing right in front of me, right here, and she raised her little Instamatic camera, and she went click, and she put her camera down, and she walked away. And I was the only one there who couldn't laugh, and I was also the only one there that knew that she had just taken an extremely close-up photograph of her very own eyeball. She had that sucker bass-ackwards, as we used to say. She had no clue. I was standing there going, oh, man, oh, MG, okay. I did not lose it. And then the last one I'm going to tell you is back at the inspection point before the guard change begins. This is October 1969. I'm waiting for the relief commander to come inspect my weapon and my uniform, and I see something coming at me on the ground. It's a little baby squirrel. And the little baby squirrel jumps up on the toe of my shoe. Then he proceeds to climb my leg on the inside of my pants. He gets up to about here, decides that's not a cool place to be, and just exits. And, whew, boy. There's a joke with a bad punchline, but I'm not going there. We walked in all weather. That's not whipped cream. Now, we were bare-eared all winter back in our day. They get ear flaps now. I call this old Army, new Army, dumb Army, smart Army, tough Army, wuss Army. I'd have worn flaps if I'd had them available, but we got flaps at night, but we didn't get flaps during the daylight hours. The saving grace was that you would turn this way and the wind would be blowing from this side, and then you'd turn this way and it'd be blowing from the other side. So the same ear wasn't getting blasted the whole time. This is the whole crew. This is Sergeant First Class Joe Dees. He was Sergeant of the Guard. This is my crew. We were all 6'2 3/4 plus or minus 1/8 of an inch. Here's the last. This is just days before I got out. And I'm going to end this part with the way I began. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will, in honored glory, rest under my eternal vigilance. And now for part 2. Who's buried in Arlington? Stories from our nation's most hallowed ground. And if you love history, you're going to love this part. Arlington is the only national cemetery that has veterans from every war from the Revolution on. Now, it wasn't a cemetery until 1864. How did they get in there? They dug them up and brought them back. It's called disinterment and reburial. There are 11 Revolutionary soldiers buried in Arlington. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. The first one being Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant designed the District of Columbia. He came to America to fight in the Revolution, much like the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a little older. He was 23. Lafayette was 19. He came in 1877. George Washington made him a combat engineer because he had an engineering and design background. And in 1790, he hired him to design the District of Columbia. He had a tiff with Congress and with Washington. He got fired, and he spent the rest of his life trying to get compensated for his work and never was. He died in poverty on a friend's farm in Prince George's County, Maryland. In 1909, the DAR and the federal government combined to go find him. They dug him up. 2 small bones, 2 teeth, and some green fuzz. And they buried him here, overlooking the city that he designed. And on the top of this is the design, right there, of the center of the District of Columbia. The other Revolutionary War hero is James McCubbin Lincoln, and he was probably the first American to die for the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. Shortly after the outbreak of the War of 1812, he and a friend, a mutual friend of Alexander Hansen, who was publishing an anti-war newspaper in Baltimore, they went to his defense, physical defense, because he was getting assaulted. The mob was threatening to tear down his place of business and kill him. Well, they fled the place of business. They went to the jail to get some shelter. The jailer put him in a cell. The mob broke in, beat up the jailer, took his keys, dragged them out, and beat them to death, or what they thought was to death. Lincoln dies. Hansen survives, and the other guy survives too. And the other guy who was with him was Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. And the guy who delivered the eulogy at the funeral was George Washington Parke Custis. And he now is laid to rest on the property that was owned by Custis and occupied by Robert E. Lee. And I forgot to mention, Robert E. Lee never owned the property. He was the guest of the wife. His son owned the property, as the Supreme Court ordered in 1882. During the construction or the expansion of the U.S. Naval Shipyard, 14 bodies were discovered. They were not identifiable. They were brought to Arlington as in a mass grave because it was by their uniforms and by the buttons they were wearing, they could tell they were from the War of 1812, and they were unknown, and they were buried in a mass grave in Arlington in 1909. Now, this is the grave of Horatio Wright. Horatio Wright was one of the engineers that completed the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument sat at 152 feet from 1854 to 1878. It was called the Stump in the district, affectionately called the Stump in the district for many years. The Army completed it in 1885, and at 555 feet 5 inches tall, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world until it was beat out by the Eiffel Tower 4 years later. So he got his own little Washington Monument on the front lawn of the Arlington House. He got about as close to the front door as anybody. However, Philip Sheridan is right over here, and I'll show you him in a minute. This is the grave of Mary Randolph. She was the first person of European descent to be buried in Arlington. She was a cousin of Mrs. Lee, and she was American royalty. She was from her mother's side, a direct descendant of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. Her father, Thomas Mann Randolph, was a 3-time governor of the state of Virginia, colony and state of Virginia. And her brother, Thomas Mann Randolph, married Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's oldest daughter. She wrote a book called The Virginia Housewife in 1824, and it was the Betty Crocker of her day. It was a bestseller, and she died in 1828. It continued to be a bestseller until the 1850s. But she is buried in this. And I don't know why they built, this is the only configuration of a grave like this, if they built that wall to keep her in or to keep people out. I'm not sure. This is the grave of George Washington Parke Custis, the builder of the Arlington House. He died in 1857. When he died, Lee became executor of his estate and custodian of the property, but he was never the owner. Robert E. Lee was never the owner of the Arlington property. And his wife, Mary L. Lee, that's the Lee that they're related to as well through the Lee family, Fitzhugh Custis, and of course she died in 1853. Robert Todd Lincoln is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln. Eddie died at age 4, Willie died at age 11, and Thomas Tad Lincoln died in Illinois in 1876 at age 18. But he lived to be 83 years old, and he was a very successful lawyer, businessman. He was president of the Pullman Company for 20 plus years. He was Secretary of War to Garfield and was an arm's length from Garfield when he was shot in 1881. He was invited to Ford's Theater the night his father was assassinated, but didn't show up until after the shooting and went to the Peterson boarding house. He was in the crowd when McKinley was shot in 1901. He refused invitation to any event where the president was to be in attendance until the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. And that's Robert Todd Lincoln. See the little bit of resemblance in the ears and the eyes, not the mouth so much. That's Warren G. Harding and William Howard Taft. 14 months and 3 days later, Warren G. Harding was dead of a heart attack in San Francisco. And their son, Abraham Lincoln II. Did you know that there was such a person? The grandson of Abraham Lincoln and the son, the only son of Robert Todd Lincoln, died while studying in Europe. His father was ambassador to the court of St. James, so they brought him from France over across the channel, and he died with his family. He got an infection in his armpit, and it killed him. Of course, that was well before penicillin. In 1890, that was well before penicillin. And the wife, Mary Harlan Lincoln, and William Howard Taft is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Helen Herron Taft is buried beside him. And he was most proud, not of his presidency, but of his time on the Supreme Court, because he's the only president to have gone on and served on the U.S. Supreme Court after being president of the United States, and he was Chief Justice. He is one of 4 Chief Justices buried in Arlington. Now, this grave and this grave have something in common. They were designed by the same sculptor, and many of you who are around my age carried his artwork in your pocket, because James Earl Fraser designed the Buffalo nickel. F for Fraser. S for San Francisco. I want this coin. I like this coin. I'd take a bunch of them. We all know, if we're of a certain age, where we were about noon of the Friday noon, November 22nd, 1963. I was at Theodore Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa, walking into 5th grade English class, and I heard somebody say that the president's been shot. And I walked into the class, and everybody said I was crazy, and the next hour they announced that President Kennedy was dead. And of course, everything stopped till Monday, except that NFL played their games, and I forgot about that, but I looked it up. The NFL played their games that weekend. So, this was the temporary grave. This is the eternal flame. I read the quartermaster's report of the guy who 18 hours before the funeral, Mrs. Kennedy decided she wanted an eternal flame. I read the quartermaster's report of the guy who made it happen. He didn't sleep. That's a luau torch from a hardware store. You got a contractor to dig a ditch out this way and put a propane tank behind some bushes, and they timed it out, how long it took from the time they turned the gas on until they could light it. Secret Service made them wet down all the greenery around here, so in fear that Mrs. Kennedy would go up in flames. This is, of course, the grave of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who lived not quite 48 hours, about 15 weeks before the president was killed. This is the grave of Arabella, who was stillborn a year before Caroline Kennedy was born. They added this little pipe here to make sure the flame does not blow out. It can blow down and then come up because it has an electronic igniter and a constant gas feed. The brothers, JFK and Jacqueline. Now, she did not want Onassis on her grave, but the Department of the Army would not bury her in Arlington unless she had her legal name of death on her gravestone. So Onassis went on. This is the grave of Robert Francis Kennedy. The only night funeral ever held in Arlington was for RFK. They had the mass in St. Patrick's in New York. They put him on a train, and 2 bystanders were killed by an oncoming train. And Ethel Kennedy insisted that the train slow down, so no more death because of Bobby. And so they got there at 9 p.m. They had lights, and that's the only nighttime graveside service ever held in Arlington was for Robert Francis Kennedy. He served in the U.S. Senate. Of course, he was Attorney General for his brother. But if you serve in the Senate or the House of Representatives or on the Supreme Court and you have at least 1 day of active duty, you qualify for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Ted Kennedy. He was born on the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. February 22nd, 1932, Washington being born February 2nd, 1732. His godfather was JFK, and JFK wanted to call him George Washington Kennedy because of the coincidence of his birth. Well, guess who overrode him? Joe Sr. He always he had the final say, of course. That's Philip Sheridan's grave right there, and that's the front of the house. We'll get to Philip Sheridan in a minute. And to the left of Ted's grave, served 47 years in the U.S. Senate. To the left of his is a memorial stone for Joe Kennedy Jr., who blew up in a bomber packed full of explosives, Project Aphrodite. They were supposed to take this thing up from England. It was supposed to grow. They were supposed to bail out when they got across the channel. And it was supposed to fly and explode in the V2 pens where they were building the V2s in Peenemünde. It blew up after it got off the ground, before they had a chance to bail out. Electrical short set the explosives off, and they never found any part of him. And Evelyn Lincoln, who was Kennedy's secretary, and Lincoln's secretary was Kennedy, and there was this whole list of things that were in common with Kennedy and Lincoln that you saw right after the Kennedy assassination in the 60s. This is a Meigs marker. This is the only one left. I think it's a work of art. They were going to use these for Civil War dead. It was way too expensive, and it had one other drawback. It was cast iron, and it would oxidize and turn red. But there's the last one left in Arlington. This is the grave of Philip Sheridan, Little Phil, the guy who burned the Shenandoah Valley in the summer of 1864. Probably pretty high in the pantheon of Union generals. I would say maybe third behind Grant and Sherman would be Phil Sheridan. Philip Kearny. Now, Philip Kearny was born to wealth. He inherited $1 million in 1836. Huge fortune in 1836. He could have lived in the lap of luxury. He wanted to be a cavalry officer. He lost his left arm at Churubusco in the Mexican War, and he pinned his sleeve up, and he rode into battle in the Civil War with the reins in his teeth and his saber in his right hand. He made the mistake of riding into Confederate lines at Chantilly in September of 1862, was ordered to halt, and he did not halt. He wheeled his horse and took off the other way back to Union lines and was shot numerous times in the back by Confederate sentries. His friend from the academy, A.P. Hill, was the Confederate commander and came out and was said to have commented, "Oh my God, you've killed Phil Kearny. He didn't deserve to die in the mud like this," but indeed he did. He was brought into Arlington in 1912. He is one of 2 equestrian statues. The other equestrian statue is to Sir John Dill, who is a British envoy to Franklin Roosevelt and who died while in the United States and was buried in Arlington. Abner Doubleday is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He never claimed to have invented baseball. He said his West Point roommate made it all up so that Cooperstown, New York would be considered the birthplace and the home of the game of baseball, the home of record of the game of baseball. He was not even in Cooperstown the summer of 1839 when he allegedly invented it. But a commission in the early 1900s confirmed that he invented baseball. So by God, if a commission said he invented it, then he did. He was in Fort Sumter when it was fired on, April 12, 1861, and was the first Union officer to request permission to return fire against the Confederate States of America. That's his place in history, but he was also at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, and played a big role in the Battle of Gettysburg. This is, again, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs. Why do I come back to him? Because he's buried at Arlington, and he was so shy and self-effacing, he put soldier, engineer, architect, scientist, patriot on his grave. And he's got a bunch of little Meigs buried around him, and all his family buried around him. He's buried there with his son, who was killed during the Civil War, and he believed, till his dying day, that he wasn't killed in combat, that he had been taken prisoner and assassinated because he was the son of Montgomery Cunningham Meigs. This is the grave of George Crook, General Crook, accepting the surrender of Geronimo in 1883. Of course, Geronimo got away, but George Crook, was a Civil War general, but also an Indian fighter, and became very sympathetic with the Native American cause and became an expert on Native American life, languages, and culture, and was considered a friend of the Native Americans after his initial career. William Stark Rosencrantz. They called George Thomas the Rock of Chickamauga. He was the chump of Chickamauga. Grant hated him forever for his retreat at Chickamauga. But for the interception of a telegram, would have been the 17th president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln wanted him to be his running partner in 1864. He had sent a telegram to Rosecrans requesting him to accept the vice president's position on his slate, and the telegram that was sent back was intercepted by Edmund Stanton, Secretary of War, and never delivered to Lincoln. And Lincoln, assuming that because he didn't get a response that he was not interested, turned to Andrew Johnson. But this man would have been the 17th president of the United States had the telegram gotten through accepting the position with Lincoln. This is the grave of Horatio Wright again. This is the grave of David D. Porter, Admiral of the Navy, and his beloved wife, who apparently has no name. And he's temporarily erected here, so I don't know if that's been for over 100 years. I don't think they're going to fix that anytime soon. William Henry Johnson. William Henry Johnson was a free black, hired in Illinois by Abraham Lincoln to come with him to be his valet. Now, I ask high school kids, what's a valet? And they say, parks your car. Well, valet in those days shined your shoes, helped you get dressed, kept your clothes in order, was your personal assistant. Well, Johnson went with Lincoln to Gettysburg when he delivered the Gettysburg Address. Mary Todd Lincoln begged Lincoln not to go because Tad was sick. The last time he had left when the kid was sick, it was Willie, and he died. But he said, I've got to go. I've got to do this. And he took, instead of Mary Todd Lincoln, he took his valet, Johnson. The night he delivered the address, he fell ill with smallpox. Johnson nursed him back to health. And Johnson fell ill with smallpox himself and succumbed January 28th, 1864, and is buried in Section 27 in Arlington as a citizen. There are 3,800 free blacks and escaped slaves buried as citizens in Arlington Cemetery, and they're all buried in Section 27, which is a stone's throw from the Iwo Jima Memorial, the Marine Memorial, which is in the north, at the far north end of Arlington. Daniel Sickles. Anybody here heard of Dan Sickles? Oh yeah, he was a piece of work, and I mean that in the worst possible way. He was a Tammany Hall congressman. Of course, Tammany Hall was the Democratic machine of the 1800s and early 1900s, and he married at age 33 a 15 or 16-year-old Italian girl against the wishes of both families. And he found out that that girl was messing around with this guy and shot him to death in front of the White House in 1859. He wasn't just anybody. He was the Attorney General for the District Attorney, pardon me, for the District of Columbia, and his name was Philip Barton Key, and he was the son of Francis Scott Key. And to make a bad pun, he got off scot-free because he hired Edwin Stanton as his defense attorney, and Edwin Stanton and his team mounted the first ever successful temporary insanity plea in U.S. jurisprudence history, getting Daniel Sickles off free. They put him in a jail cell. They let him keep his pistol. And they put him in the warden's office so all of his congressional buddies could come and congratulate him for ridding the district of this scoundrel. Fast forward, Gettysburg, day 2. He takes his 3rd Corps on the left flank forward to the Peach Orchard, and they get slammed by Confederate artillery, and he does so without orders from George Meade, and George Meade is furious. Should have court-martialed him on the spot, but he didn't. But then he has the temerity to lobby Congress for 30 more years for a Medal of Honor for his heroic actions at Gettysburg. And guess what? They relent. His leg got shattered by a Confederate ball at the Peach Orchard. He had it amputated, and he donated the leg and the ball to the Army Medical Museum, where it can still be seen today. And he would frequently go and visit his leg. And I've even heard that he wanted a Medal of Honor for his leg. So much for Dan Sickles. But Medal of Honor. Moses J. Ezekiel was the first Jew ever admitted to VMI, 1862. He fought with the battalion of cadets at the Battle of Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley, was wounded but survived, and went on to become a world-famous sculptor and sculpted this magnificent piece. It's about 30 feet tall. To the Confederate dead who were buried in Arlington, yes, there are 483 of them buried in Arlington, not too far from the tomb of the unknown soldier. And it says on the back, not for fame or reward, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it, these men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. And that can be said of many soldiers in many armies, in many wars. They did their duty. And they are buried beneath graves like this. Now, this is a distinctive grave. It has the Maltese cross with a wreath in it, and it's pointed at the top. And there are 2 theories. It's pointed so it'll be easily distinguishable from a Union grave that's round at the top, or that is pointed so that no damn Yankee would sit on them. Now, this kid apparently didn't get the message. This is at the dedication in 1914. And here's an aerial view. Ezekiel dies in Europe in 1917. He lived in Italy for 40 years, was a valued citizen of Italy. And they brought him here in 1921 and buried him at the foot of the statue that he created to honor the Confederate dead, of which he was now one. And his funeral was the first ever state funeral. There have only been 9 of them in the National Memorial Amphitheater. Interesting to me that the first state funeral in this place was for a Confederate Jew. Second funeral was for the World War I unknown. The third funeral was for Charles Young, the 3rd black to graduate from West Point and the 1st black to achieve the rank of colonel in the United States Army. I asked a bunch of sixth graders who this was. Mark Twain? No. Einstein? No. Einstein's hairdresser? No. This is Ignaz Jan Paderewski. He was a concert pianist, virtuoso, a household name around the turn of the century. He was Prime Minister of Poland in 1919 and was president of the Polish government in exile in 1941 when he died in New York. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed that he should lie in state beneath the mast of the Maine until Poland was free. He went in there in 41. He stayed there until 92 because Poland was not free until the Soviet Union fell apart and Poland became a free and independent country. And he lay in state. He was on a gurney in a casket here. We could go and look at him. A friend of mine said, I have the key. We can get in. You want to go look at him? Really look at him? I said, no, thank you. There's the mast of the Maine. It was harvested from Havana Harbor in 1912 and brought to Arlington. Pieces of the Maine went to all kinds of different places. There are memorials all over that have bits and pieces of the Maine. This is the main mast. I believe the foremast went to Annapolis and is in Annapolis. And here's the mass burial. The victims of the Maine, 261 of them, were initially, the bulk of them were buried in Cuba, and then in December of 1899, right before the turn of the century, they were brought and buried in Arlington in a mass service. Not a mass grave, but a mass burial in a mass service. And many of them unknown. The cause of the blast, the Rickover Commission in the 70s thought pretty much that it was an accident caused by a coal bunker fire that burned through and lit the magazine of the Maine, and it blew up, blew the front of the ship, basically blew the front of the ship off, and killed many, many sailors. 4 of them in one casket, okay? That tells you something. That's TR. That's Leonard Wood. That's Fightin' Joe Wheeler. Who was Fightin' Joe Wheeler? He was a Confederate general, 5'3" of him. Feisty little guy. But he was with Joseph E. Johnston till the last, till he was surrendered with Johnson the 26th of April, 17 days after Appomattox. He was the commander of the Rough Riders. He was second in command, okay? Leonard Wood was in command of the Rough Riders. But Fightin' Joe Wheeler put on the blue coat and fought for the United States of America against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. When he died in 1906, he was an 8-term congressman from Alabama. When he died in 1906, he decided he wanted to be buried at Arlington, and raised a howl across the South. What's this Confederate soldier being buried at Arlington? What's this all about? Well, he did choose Arlington. And as a short guy, he chose a nice monument. William Jennings Bryan is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 3-time presidential hopeful from Nebraska, a very ethical, moral, religious man who lost twice to McKinley and once to Taft. But he's probably best known for the Scopes trial, the evolution trial in Tennessee. That's Clarence Darrow next to him. He died less than a week after the end of the trial. He was worn out. His heart gave out on him. This is the grave of Earl Warren. This is my Supreme Court part. And Warren Earl Burger. This was, Earl Warren was appointed by Ike, and one of the quotes, great quotes, is Eisenhower said, appointing Earl Warren to the court was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. Because he made some wrote some opinions that were very much opposed to what Eisenhower was all about. And Warren Burger and William Rehnquist. Oliver Wendell Holmes is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and he served the longest on the Supreme Court, 36 years on the U.S. Supreme Court. Here are 4 in a row. No other cemetery anywhere has more than 4, and that's the Rock Creek Cemetery in the district. There are 3 at Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts. William Brennan, Potter Stewart, Thurgood Marshall, Harry Blackman. There's William O. Douglas. Oh, Hyman, hello. He was a maverick, hated rules, but he was considered the father of the nuclear navy. Arthur Goldberg, Hugo Black, simple GI headstone. And Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall did not serve in the U.S. military, but was given in 1993 a special presidential waiver to be buried at Arlington because that was his request, was to be buried at Arlington. He argued 32 cases in front of the Supreme Court and won 29 of them. He was Solicitor General before he was appointed to the Supreme Court and was the first black ever appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Medgar Evers is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was field secretary for the NAACP, was murdered in his driveway after going and hearing JFK's speech, a civil rights speech, very famous civil rights speech, and he was murdered that night by Byron Della Beckwith, who finally was convicted in the 1990s. There were 2 hung juries in the 60s, and he died in prison in the 2000s. And these are mother's tears. If you are familiar with the Jewish tradition of mother's tears, these are mother's tears, very, very large mother's tears at his grave. Spotswood Poles was considered the best black player in the Negro Leagues before the First World War. He had a lifetime average of over 400. He batted .620 against Major League pitching in exhibition games and served as in the First World War, 93rd Division. Daniel Chappie James is buried in Arlington, the first black to achieve a 4-star rank in any service. Roscoe Robinson also is buried at Arlington, the first black 4-star in the Army. He was a Tuskegee Airman, although he never flew in combat with the Airmen. He was an ace in Korea, Vietnam, and got his 4th star in the late 1970s. This is James Parks. James Parks was born a slave owned by George Washington Parke Custis. He was liberated by the Union troops. He worked as a bricklayer and built the brick barracks that I lived in Fort Myer. Then he became a gravedigger and dug graves by hand from 1864 to 1925. He retired in 1925, died in 1929. He was asked to be a consultant when they in the 1920s, redid the Lee Mansion because he remembered where stuff was. He had 22 children. He didn't just dig graves. He died in 1929 and was given special permission to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Matthew Henson, the right-hand man, African-American right-hand man to Robert Peary, was with Peary at the North Pole, probably planted the flag, and unless you believe that they didn't quite make it, which is what the National Geographic Society thinks. And Robert Peary with the star at the North Pole. Discoverer of the North Pole. I think we knew it was there. I think he was the first one to get there, but you know, go figure. And this guy, the real live inspiration for Indiana Jones. Expert in South American culture and archaeology, Hiram Bingham, discoverer of Machu Picchu, and senator from Connecticut. Richard Byrd, who flew over both poles, and his co-pilot, Floyd Bennett, whose wife, Cora, either is very old or decided not to be buried with Floyd. And John Wesley Powell. He lost his right arm at Shiloh in the Civil War, but that didn't keep him from mounting 2 expeditions down the Grand Canyon, the first in 1869, and mapped and explored the Grand Canyon and became an expert linguist and an expert in Native American cultures and a friend of the Native Americans. Adolphus Greeley, founder of the National Geographic Society, and John J. Pershing doing his very best Alex Trebek lookalike thing. Here. He was General of the Armies, plural. Nobody ever had that rank in their own lifetime. George Washington was given that rank retroactively at the bicentennial, but he had that rank during his life. It was before the 5-star rank was created, so he never wore more than 4 stars. He plated his silver stars gold to indicate that rank. But Armies, plural, is higher than 5 stars, so he would be considered a 6-star if there was a star ranking applied to him. And to his right is buried his grandson, Richard W. Pershing, 2nd Lieutenant, U.S. Army, killed in Vietnam, February 17th, 1968. And not far from them is the grave of Frank Buckles, the last surviving World War I veteran who lived to be 110 years and 26 days. And Edward F. Younger, the man who selected the World War I unknown, is buried in Arlington. And the guy who designed the tomb of the unknown soldier, Lorimer Rich, is buried in Arlington within sight of his creation. 3 of the 6 in this statue are buried at Arlington. Michael Strank, the old man, Rene Gagnon, and the Pima Indian who died tragically in 1955, Ira Hamilton Hayes. The Willie and Joe cartoon guy. He was in the Army. That was his job. And Patton wanted to censor him because some of his stuff was pretty edgy. You know what Ike said? Let him do it. The boys love him. The boys love him. Don't shut him up. Memorial Section K, Glenn Miller. Never found. Disappeared over the English Channel, flying from London to Paris, December 1944. And these are memorial sections. Lost at sea. And the USS Rona, we were talking about this. I was talking with your director about this, and that's pretty interesting. This ship was HMT Rona, and it was destroyed, sunk by a Nazi radio-guided buzz bomb on the 26th of November of 1943 in the Mediterranean in support of the war in North Africa. And 1,015 American soldiers drowned. It was hushed up for many years. They didn't want the public to know that we had lost that many soldiers at one shot. This is the hedge. This is the tomb here. On the other side of this hedge is my favorite section. Hang on. Frank Reynolds, ABC News. John Mitchell. Only 200 graves in this section. You know about every 4th one. Al Haig. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. He died in poverty. He died heavily in debt to the IRS. His funeral was paid for by Max Schmeling, who had become his dear friend after the war. His funeral and his headstone paid for by Max Schmeling. And there he is receiving Legion of Merit. Lee Marvin is right next to him. I think by choice. I think Marvin wanted to be next to Lewis because I think he was his hero. The Dirty Dozen, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, my favorite ever Western. Lee Van Cleef, Strother Martin, okay. Creighton Abrams was the spear of Patton's Third Army and was in either the first or the second tank to liberate Bastogne. He got the Silver Star twice on the way in. His wife, Julia Abrams, started the Army chapter of the Arlington Ladies. Those are the people who go to every funeral so that no veteran is buried alone. Jimmy Doolittle of Doolittle's Raiders. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. Spencer Tracy. Pappy Boynton, about 30 feet away from Doolittle. Pappy because he was 10 years older than his boys. Clark Clifford. Maxwell Taylor. These are all in this section of 200 graves. And Matt Urban from Holland, Michigan. Most decorated soldier in the U.S. Army in the Second World War. Everybody says, hold on, that was Audie Murphy. Murphy died in 71. He did not get his medal until 81. His medals lined up almost perfectly, with the exception of the Legion of Merit. He did not have a Legion of Merit, but he had 6 oak leaf clusters on his Purple Heart. He was wounded 7 times and is considered by the Guinness Book to be the most decorated soldier in the Second World War of the U.S. Army. This guy's from Pueblo, Colorado. I keep him in for local color. Cap Weinberger. And this guy, and I just saw this grave when I was in Arlington the last time. My dad's sister ship was the Fisk, and the Fisk was cut in half by a German U-boat torpedo on the August 2nd of 1944. And my dad's ship rescued the survivors. 33 died. And I saw this grave, and I said, that's got to be the namesake of my dad's sister ship, DE-143. And indeed, it was Bradley Allen Fisk. And John Shalikashvili. We're out of Section 7 now. This guy was drafted in 1958 and became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Born in Poland, go figure. I'm in the medical part. Leonard Wood. Leonard Wood had a very dramatic rise in his career until Army Chief of Staff. And he was hoping he would be, have Pershing's as command of the Army, the Expeditionary Force in World War I, but did not get it. Walter Reed, Albert Sabin, who invented the oral polio vaccine. And of Rotarians, raise your hands. Fred, got your hand up there. Without this guy's invention, we would not be this close to killing polio worldwide. And Michael DeBakey. Now, Michael DeBakey invented the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. That was his brainchild, MASH units. He also invented a lot of pumps and things that made heart transplants and heart-lung machines viable. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Richard Nixon, and it was later discovered he was on Nixon's enemies list. Go figure. Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers, buried at Arlington. And Thomas E. Selfridge, the first human being to die in an airplane accident. He was the first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. On the 17th of September 1908, was riding around Fort Myer with Orville Wright, and they went in, the propeller broke, and they crashed, and the engine block hit him in the back of the head and fractured his skull, and he died 3 hours later. Orville Wright survived. Thomas E. Selfridge is buried in Arlington, about 300 yards from where the plane crashed. This is Dashiell Hammett. He wrote The Maltese Falcon, The Thin Man, The Red Harvest, The Dane Curse, The Glass Key. He became an American communist, member of the American Communist Party in 1937. But he served honorably in 2 wars. After he became a communist, he served as a newspaper editor in the Aleutian Islands in the Alaska Department. He got a medical for tuberculosis in World War I, and when he died, J. Edgar Hoover wanted to deny him burial at Arlington. And you know what the Department of the Army said to J. Edgar? He goes in. They buried him there. J. Edgar Hoover did not have absolute power, even though he thought he did. Francis Gary Powers, U-2 pilot, convicted spy by the Soviets. And John Glenn, 3 of the Mercury 7, Glenn, Grissom, and Pete Conrad are buried at Arlington. And Virgil Grissom and Grand Rapids native Roger Chaffee, buried next to Gus Grissom. They both perished in the Apollo 1 fire, and I know where I was that time. I was in the basement of the Delta Upsilon fraternity house playing pool when I heard the news that the Apollo 1 fire had taken place. Pete Conrad, if you read the right stuff, he was the character that he was. Stuart Roosa, and when you see those USAA commercials, ours was earned orbiting the moon in 1972. Those are his granddaughters. Apollo 14 command module pilot. James Irwin, Dick Scobie, Michael John Smith, captain. Now I want you to notice some dates here. I'm just going to back up. January 27th. January 28th. Okay, and we're going to go to Laurel Clark of the Columbia, February 1. Within 6 calendar days, January 27, 28, February 1, all of NASA's fatal accidents have occurred in 6 calendar days. I wouldn't want to fly in that time slot. David Brown, Michael Anderson, and the commingled unidentifiable remains of the Columbia astronauts. Audie Murphy is the 3rd most visited grave in Arlington after the tomb and JFK. And from Muskegon, Michigan, Jumpin' Joe Byerly. Was in the 506 of the 101st Airborne. He had parachuted into France twice behind enemy lines, had escaped both times. And the second time he escaped, he went east to Russian lines and surrendered with a pack of Luckies in his hand, saying, Amerikansky, Amerikansky. And he surrendered to a female battalion tank commander who took him in and believed his story and let him wear a Soviet uniform and fight on in with him. The only person to have worn both an American and Soviet uniform in the Second World War, Muskegon native Jumpin' Joe Byerly. And his son is speaking tonight somewhere in Grand Rapids. I think that's where my friend Neil is. Nathan Bedford Forrest, yes, the great-great-great-grandson of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate cavalry officer and first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. He was the first American general to die in the Second World War in a B-17 in 1943 over Germany. Leslie Groves, the guy who got to herd geniuses at the Manhattan Project. And Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, the highest-ranking American officer ever to be taken prisoner in the Second World War. He was ended up in Manchuria, was liberated by Soviets, and he was, George Marshall put him up for a Medal of Honor in '42, and MacArthur shot him down. After they gave the 5-star ranks out, guess who was outranking who? Marshall outranked MacArthur by 2 days, and when he put him up for a Medal of Honor again, MacArthur didn't say squat. And here's their lovely reunion. Are you gonna kiss me? Or what? Okay. They held no animosity after the war. At least Mayhew Wainwright has held no animosity after the war. Anthony McAuliffe, who was left by Maxwell Taylor. Maxwell Taylor was in London. He was supposed to be in command of the 101st Airborne in Bastonia when they got surrounded by the Bulge. This is the guy who said, nuts. You're gonna surrender? Nuts. They didn't know what to do. What does nuts mean? Omar Bradley. It was our day off at the tomb when his funeral occurred at the U.S. Capitol building. We were called out to open dignitaries' car doors. The first door I get's the Shah of Iran. He's about 5'6". Next door I get's Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. He's about 4'10". Next door I get's George Romney, Mitt's dad, from Michigan, I believe. Governor, yes. Secretary of Commerce at the time for Nixon, and then I get Speaker of the House McCormick. When the ceremony's all over, there's a staff car coming out from the east steps of the Capitol building, and I'm going to whoop a salute on it because it has red flags. That's a general officer. And when it gets close enough that I realize he can't see my eyes, and nor can his driver, I just take a quick glance down with my eyes. I don't move my head, and I see a feeble hand return my salute, and there are 5 stars on the epaulet. Omar Bradley returned my salute at his buddy Ike's funeral. Now, there were 9 who were given the 5th star, Fleet Admiral and General of the Army. One of them was Bradley. One of them was Marshall. Marshall, Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan, and Secretary of State for Harry S. Truman. Henry Hap Arnold, the inventor of the Air Force, basically the father of the Air Force. William Leahy, first to get the 5th star, December 15, 1944. They gave him successive 7 days in a row. His was first. He was Chief of Naval Operations at the outbreak of the war. And Bull Halsey got his 1 year later in '45. John Foster Dulles, Anita McGee, first American Army surgeon in the Spanish-American War. Grace Hopper, Rear Admiral, invented COBOL, Common-Oriented Business Language, first early computer language. The men were into the hardware, the women were into the software. Ollie Josephine Prescott Baird Bennett, the first contract surgeon of World War I. She was a commissioned officer. She also wins the award for most names. And I don't know who this guy was. I was just walking through the cemetery one day and took this photo, but he was a Muslim who fought in the Second World War for the U.S. John Theron Coulter, who was he? I don't know, but he was the 5th and final husband of Constance Bennett, the actress, sister of Joan Bennett and star of Topper with Cary Grant. Maureen O'Hara is buried in Arlington. Her 3rd and final husband was an Air Force Brigadier General as well, named Charlie Blair. And Ludwig Bemelmans is buried in Arlington. And if you have daughters, how many have daughters? You've read his books. In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines. They left the house at 9:30. The smallest one was Madeline by Ludwig Bemelmans. George Westinghouse, let's hear it for alternating current. Dwight Philly Davis of the Davis Cup of Tennis. And finally, my last slide, my last person is Henry Martin Robert. Now, he was the chief of engineers in the Civil War, and he came back and started going to meetings of veterans of the war, and they descended into chaos, and he got sick and tired of it, so he went home and wrote Robert's Rules of Order, based on the rules of the House of Representatives and a little bit of common sense. I come back to this place because part of me will always be here. The people I've shown you, most of them chose Arlington as their final resting place. Arlington chose the unknowns. And I'm going to finish with a story that I have heard versions of from the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s until they moved the chains back and there was no interplay between the sentinel anymore and the public. And this one comes from 1965. A sentinel had just come to this end of the mat, had faced, and he heard footsteps and weeping approaching him from behind. And the chains are right there, so the footsteps come right up to him and they stop. And then a female voice says, "My son disappeared in France in 1944. My son disappeared in France in 1944. This is the only place I have. God bless you, son, and thank you." And the steps go away, and he never sees her face. But he knows here the full measure of this place. It's symbolic for all Americans, for all who served and all who died, but it is the place for those whose loved ones did not return. This is their grave. This is their home. I was asked in the Q&A session after speaking at the National World War II Museum on Memorial Day of 2016, with all this DNA, there won't be any more unknowns, and when are we going to stop guarding the tomb? And I said, when there is no longer a United States of America. This place is special and will be forever to all Americans. Thank you for coming. Do we have a mic out in the audience? Yes, sir. That's a great question. Arlington recently knocked down the Navy Annex, and also known as the Roach Hotel. The Navy Annex is given 35 more acres. It is said, and I'm not buying this completely, that it will allow veteran burials at current rates until 2060. Now, the qualifications for Arlington, it used to be anybody with an honorable discharge. After the Kennedy assassination 4 years later, that changed, and it went to Purple Heart, Silver Star, or higher, retired, died on active duty, etc. I don't qualify for in-ground burial at Arlington because I don't hit any of those qualifications. But at current rates, at 25 to 30 funerals per day, they're not all veteran funerals, some of them are spousal. When the veteran funerals are done, spousal burials will continue until the last one is performed. Then it will become not an active cemetery, but will be turned over to the Department of the Interior, National Park Service, just like Gettysburg. That answer? Anybody else? Yes, sir. You're most welcome. No, the Army administers Arlington. The National Park Service has 24 acres in and around the Arlington House Mansion. So when you go to the Arlington House, you see a Smokey Bear guy. Okay, I don't know if those budget cuts are going to be felt there or not. But Arlington is continued to be run by the burial part of Arlington is still under the Department of the Army. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Senator Tom Cotton was our speaker at our reunion last time, and he's an Army Ranger and was an officer in the Old Guard. And of course, he wanted to tell us what we wanted to hear, but he said guarding the tomb's too important to give it to an officer. It's always been enlisted, it's always been U.S. Army, and it's always been the people who walk the mat are usually E3 to E5. And E5 to E6 are relief commanders, and E7 is sergeant of the guard. There's a platoon leader who is an officer, but we won't let officers walk the mat. I love officers. They're good people. Yes, ma'am. The Vietnam is empty and will remain so because now with the mitochondrial DNA technology, just a few cells they can identify. Guys who go into the Army now, we gave fingerprints, they get fingerprints and a swab. So if they get any part of somebody, they can tell who it is. There will be MIA in future conflicts. There will not be bodies we cannot identify. So there will not be anybody put in the Vietnam grave. There will not be any other unknowns beyond. Yes, ma'am. I am certain there are because Daniel Chappie James was one of them. I had a Tuskegee Airman at one of my speeches on Thursday, and I think he said he was going to be buried at Arlington eventually. I would have to do a little research, but I'm sure there are more than a handful buried in Arlington. The WASPs, yes, there are several WASPs. I have another program, it's called the Women of Arlington. I have featured 3 of them, and there are more, but there's no database because they were not military. And so I asked the historian at Arlington, he says, well, we can't tell. You'd have to go through the list, every one of them, and enter them and see if they come up in the Arlington database because they were not considered military. They did not get any benefits, and even those who died in accidents, their families had to pay for their transport home. They are now qualified for burial at Arlington, and then there was a little pushback from some veterans groups that I think it's been resolved that they are allowed in-ground burial at Arlington. There are several whose husbands were retired, and so they were buried with their husbands, and there was no issue with their burial because they were spousal burials. Yes, sir.
Have you always been treated with great respect, and do they prevent people protesting or being disrespectful?
In my day, if people got loud, you could come to Port Arms and say,
It is requested that visitors maintain a mature and reverent attitude in the vicinity of the tomb.
that usually shut them up. We do have civilian guards there who can get MPs if we need MPs. We are mostly ceremonial, but we will protect the immediate area around the tomb. We will not go after somebody who's doing crazy stuff.
One more question.
All right. I think it's...
Thank you very much.
I would just like to present you, sir, first of all, absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Just want to present you a very small token of our esteem. These are our President Ford pens, engraved pens, and sir, this is for you. And again, thank you very much for coming here and giving an absolutely wonderful, wonderful lecture. Again, please, thank you.